Millions of tons of perfect alien engineering were preparing to become cosmic dust due to a sudden automation failure within a radar dead zone. The alien crew waited in humble resignation for their approaching doom, as in their sterile culture, any sign of fatigue or a plea for help meant an immediate dispatch for recycling. To pull the heavy cargo caravan out of the crossfire, the Earth technician, Tara, had to take the controls into her own hands and commit an act of sabotage that was unthinkable by insectoid standards. Her primary rescue tool against the patrol cruisers and the ruthless bureaucracy of the Allies became an old, dented thermos filled with cheap coffee. Navigation screens across the vast command center died simultaneously. There were no warning sirens, nor was there any alarming blink of emergency lights. A sudden, suffocating blackness swallowed all the workstations, leaving behind only the heavy, vibrating hum of the cargo ships continuing their movement by inertia. For the insectoid crew of this caravan, the moment that had arrived was far more terrifying than a hull breach. Their collective reality, calibrated to the millimeter and governed by flawless automated protocols, simply ceased to exist. Meridian, the shift lead, froze before the central console. His 4 upper limbs hung motionlessly along his chitin-covered torso, while his faceted eyes darted frantically across the dead, glossy surfaces. In their culture, every operational action required a confirmed system command, and the absence of a data stream meant a total functional standstill. Around him, the command center crew began to emit rapid, chaotic clicking sounds, losing synchronization. The caravan found itself in a blind spot between 2 warring territories, deprived of all its sensory eyes. Meridian forced his mandibles to snap shut and, with a sharp click, ordered a deep manual reboot according to Protocol 47. Subordinates rushed to their posts, feverishly entering long combinations of emergency codes, but the complex electronics remained dead. The threat of straying from the invisible fairway and drifting directly into the crossfire grew with every passing second. Tara, the emergency shift technician, did not even waste time attempting to revive the dark consoles. While the insectoids desperately tried to resurrect the network, she walked with heavy steps past the main terminals and stopped at a small technical porthole protected by an armored grate. It was an archaic design element, left by engineers only for visual inspection of the outer hull, which the advanced sensory systems always ignored as useless. The thick, multi-layered glass was now rapidly freezing from the outside. Tara leaned in, almost touching it, squinting against the icy breath of the void coming from beyond. A thin layer of dense frost crawled across the lower right corner, crystallizing at a very specific sharp angle. She pressed her bare palm against the cold metal frame, catching a faint, uneven vibration of the hull. Perfect ship analyzers would have considered this insignificant background noise, but for a human accustomed to patching failing life support systems on rusty mining stations, it was a perfectly clear piece of physical evidence. The massive caravan was drifting, tilting down and to the left, sucked into an invisible gravitational vortex of the dead sector. If this dangerous drift were not compensated for within the next few minutes, the colossal mass of the ships would drag them directly into a debris field. The clicking in the command center escalated into a deafening, disorienting rattle. The deep reboot had failed. The backup optical circuits did not respond. True panic, a state fundamentally alien to their orderly collective mind, was ready to finally paralyze the crew. Tara turned away from the cold porthole, gave a heavy sigh, and reached into her deep tool belt. Instead of a calibrator, she pulled out an old, badly dented earth thermos, covered in a thick web of scratches and faded technical stickers. The metal cylinder looked incredibly wild amidst the elegant alien geometry of the control panels. In the sudden, ringing silence that followed her strange gesture, Tara casually unscrewed the lid, brought the rim to her lips, and took a slow, deliberately long sip of the dark, thick-smelling liquid. Meridian stared at her as if he had seen a ghost, his sensitive antennae trembling slightly from extreme tension. To him, this steel container held an unknown, highly complex chemical reagent, and the fragile human was voluntarily pouring it into herself at the very moment their flagship was hurtling toward inevitable destruction. "If I'd known you were going to turn the lights off so soon, I would have grabbed some decent snacks from my cabin instead of this wrench," Tara said loudly, wiping dark droplets from her chin with the back of her sleeve. The pure absurdity of this mundane statement, an absolutely calm, inappropriate reaction to a deadly threat, shattered the rising wave of panic with a heavy blow. A flurry of nervous, intermittent clicks rippled across the command center, which, for this race, sounded remarkably like exhausted, tension-releasing laughter. The perfect stupor was broken by the wrong human behavior. Giving the crew no time to return to their fear, Tara stepped toward the main navigation console and, with a dull metallic thud, set her heavy thermos right in the very center of the dead instrument panel. She did not screw the lid back on. The hot liquid inside swayed and then stilled, forming a perfectly horizontal plane relative to the ship's actual position in space. Tara leaned over it, watching intently as the edge of the dark drink slowly crept toward the metal rim due to the deck's ongoing, dangerous tilt. She pointed a finger smeared with technical grease at the senior insectoid, firmly declaring that he was now her personal assistant and must immediately take his place at the manual thrust valves. Meridian froze for a fraction of a second, processing the command. The manual valves were massive mechanical levers built into the floor, created by engineers solely to prevent catastrophic failures during docking at the platform. They required monstrous physical strength and provided absolutely no systemic feedback. Grabbing them meant stepping beyond every safety rule known to his race. Tara tapped her fingernail loudly against the metal side of the thermos, never taking her eyes off her improvised spirit level, and told him to grab the left levers before the heavy caravan capsized completely. Meridian stepped forward, his heavy boots thudding loudly against the metal deck. He wrapped his two powerful lower manipulators around the cold, long, unlubricated ribbed handles of the direct control system. His entire large frame radiated extreme doubt and peak muscular strain. Executing a human's commands by following the behavior of liquid in a primitive vessel seemed to him a suicidally risky move, contradicting all flight logic. And yet, when Tara hoarsely shouted the first correction, simultaneously monitoring the angle of the growing frost on the glass and the surface of the liquid in the thermos, Meridian pulled the stiff lever toward himself with all his might. The physical effort forced him to spread his supporting legs wide. The chitinous plates on his back creaked alarmingly as he overcame the colossal mechanical resistance of the old valves. Deep in the very belly of the ship, the dormant maneuvering thrusters came to life with a heavy, vibrating growl, sending a violent shudder through all the floor plates. The massive flagship made its first, agonizingly slow lurch forward on pure, blind manual thrust. Tara kept her hands a millimeter away from the hot cylinder, shouting out short course corrections, while Meridian, physically exhausted within the first few minutes of this hellish labor, the shift lead fought fiercely with the stubborn levers to maintain the hull's alignment. The caravan began to inch slowly forward through the dead zone, relying only on the grinding of stressed bulkheads, the freezing moisture on the forgotten glass, and a worn metal object, standing solitary on a completely deactivated control panel. The weight of millions of tons of metal, stripped of intelligent automatic mass compensation, now hung exclusively on two mechanical levers. Meridian gripped them so tightly that a complex pattern of blood vessels stood out clearly on his thick chitinous forearms. Every break in thrust, every uneven jolt from the dormant maneuvering engines, echoed as a painful searing spasm in his joints. The massive cargo caravan crawled blindly through the dead sector, and this desperate process proved to be deafeningly loud. Without the synchronizing algorithms that usually smooth the journey, the ships jerked, their magnetic couplings groaned under the strain, and the multi-layered armor rubbed together with a low, skin-crawling screech. This acoustic assault radiated in heavy waves through an invisible gravitational funnel, carrying the vibration far beyond the reach of any optical visibility. There, in the deep cold darkness, where even the most advanced radars failed, this crude mechanical pulse became a perfect navigational beacon. Something massive, patiently hidden among a dense field of drifting debris, unerringly caught the rhythm of the tearing metal. An external threat, long accustomed to the dead silence of this zone, slowly stirred into motion, shifting its trajectory directly toward the source of the chaotic noise. On the bridge, the deck suddenly dropped out from under their feet, due to a sharp change in external pressure. With a low growl, Meridian yanked the left valve toward himself, attempting to level out a dangerous list, and from this monstrous physical effort, a violent shudder ran through the load-bearing walls. A heavy ventilation grate tore loose from a ceiling niche with a ringing metallic clang, struck the edge of the navigation table, and flew toward the walkway. Behind it, in the newly opened dark technical cavity, a strange substance shimmered faintly. It was thick slime, darkened by time, which had in places melted the thick communication cables down to bare copper wires. The ship's perfect scanners, back when they still functioned properly, had ignored this hidden compartment for many months. The high technology simply did not recognize the organic trail as a system error or a voltage drop, dismissing it as an insignificant margin of error. The dried, aggressive streaks clearly indicated that the sturdy insulation had been eaten away not by a short circuit, but by someone's long physical presence inside the ship. Tara cast a quick, evaluative glance at the exposed housing, noting the nature of the melting, but she had no time for a detailed study of the evidence. The dark liquid in the old thermos swayed dangerously again, demanding an immediate course correction. Dry heat from the overloaded maneuvering turbines began to push directly through the thick armored floor plates. The temperature in the command center rose relentlessly, making the air heavy and stale. Meridian's faceted eyes clearly captured the dense thermal distortions rising around the central control shaft. According to all the unshakable laws of the insectoids and every strict regulation of their work culture, what was happening at this moment was far worse than a direct collision with an asteroid. Systems deprived of cooling recorded critical wear on components, acoustic masking was completely destroyed, and the precious cargo was being subjected to unplanned, destructive stresses. For a shift lead, such a ragged flight meant the guaranteed loss of all containers and an immediate designation as an incompetent link. The instinct of collective order loudly demanded an end to the agony of the complex mechanism. Meridian slowly tensed his rear supporting limbs, heavily shifting his stance. His death grip on the ribbed handles shifted. Instead of pulling them carefully for a maneuver, he prepared to harshly slam both valves into the floor to their very limit. One powerful movement, and the heavy caravan would cut all thrust, stop forever, and humbly await its fate in a proper silence, just as the instructions dictated during a total navigation failure. Tara noticed in time how the sturdy chitin on his broad shoulders had darkened from extreme exhaustion, and how violently the manipulators were trembling, locked immovably onto the control rods. She understood with absolute clarity that the insectoid was ready to give up, not because of simple weakness, but because of an unbearable internal conflict between the flawless rules of his species and this brutal, barbaric manual control. The shift lead intended to shut down the engines for good, cutting off their single tiny chance of escaping the trap. Without ceasing to watch the white edge of the freezing porthole closely, she stepped away from the dead console and took a heavy stride toward her partner. Instead of a sharp shout or a direct military command, she decided to use that strange psychological weapon which had already successfully worked against their iron logic once before. "It seems the local road services haven't repaired this section since the time of first contact," Tara said in a flat, almost bored voice, overplaying the rising roar of the turbines. "I honestly thought we would just get shaken up a bit on a couple of deep potholes, but this is starting to feel like a ride on an old washboard with broken leaf springs." Meridian froze, caught off guard by the human's completely inappropriate intonation. Internally, he had expected loud panic, a harsh order, or a desperate plea, but certainly not a mundane critique of the invisible space road's quality. In that saving second of brief confusion, Tara reached out a grease-stained hand to the center panel, carefully picked up her dented steel thermos that had served them as a spirit level, and resolutely pushed it right toward the tired insectoid's face. Thick steam from the dark, hot drink softly brushed against his sensitive receptor antennae. "Drink this immediately," she commanded curtly, nodding at the metal cylinder. "Your biological actuators are going to burn out right now much faster than our old engines. This stuff won't violate your vaunted chemical purity. It will simply provide the necessary sharp impulse to the central nervous system. You can safely consider it emergency technical maintenance for the main steering mechanism." For Meridian, this simple gesture went beyond any conceivable boundaries of regulatory behavior. Voluntarily accepting an unknown, complex reagent from a representative of a completely different species during a critical emergency was absolutely unthinkable. but the heat radiating from the worn vessel and the pulsing, searing pain in his own joints made him forget the protocols for a moment. He carefully transferred the heavy lever to one pair of strong manipulators and took the thermos with the other pair, distrustfully. Taking the first cautious sip, the insectoid sensed a bitter, extremely concentrated taste that instantly hit all his receptors, accelerating his blood flow and relieving part of the deep muscle spasm. It was a tiny, absolutely incorrect action from the system's point of view, creating the first solid precedent of trust and extra-regulatory assistance between their species. Meridian silently returned the thermos to the smooth panel and gripped the control valves with doubled physical strength. The caravan squeezed through another dense cluster of invisible debris with a terrifying screech, stripping away pieces of the outer hull. Meridian was no longer gasping from total exhaustion, having gained a reprieve, but his hands remained rigidly locked on the thrust-cut levers in an uncompromising grip. He did not stop the ships right then, but he was mentally prepared to abort this crude, suicidal maneuver at any second, contrary to Tara's plan, while the deafening noise of their braking caravan continued to draw the attention of whoever was moving to intercept them in the cold darkness. Meridian squeezed the massive mechanical manual thrust levers so hard that his durable chitinous carapace emitted a continuous, painful crunching sound. The weight of millions of tons of cargo, stripped of smart automatic mass compensation, hung solely upon his joints. The exertion, intended by ship engineers only for a brief emergency docking at the port, had already lasted far too long. From the intense friction of internal cartilage in the stale, overheated air of the command center, a sharp, nauseating smell of burnt organics emerged. The insectoid's four supporting limbs began to lose their perfect synchronization, shaking slightly from extreme muscular exhaustion. Yet, he gripped the ribbed handles deathly tight, rigidly blocking any attempts by the Earth technician to take over the controls. Tara exhaled heavily, wiped the sweat from her forehead with a sleeve smeared in technical grease, and cast a careful look at her old dented thermos, left in the very center of the dead console. The liquid inside no longer served them as a level to align the tilt. Now, a fine rhythmic ripple ran across the dark, hot surface. Tiny waves radiated from the center to the edges with frightening regularity, creating a complex pattern that completely overpowered the chaotic trembling of their own straining engines. This was an entirely alien acoustic pulse. Dull, measured thuds were transmitted through the caravan's outer multi-layered armor, making the deck vibrate beneath her boots. Tara pressed her ear against the frozen metal frame of the porthole. The ship's perfect optical sensors were dead, but the water and the vibrating bulkhead spoke clearly of what the deactivated radars had missed. Drawn by the deafening noise of their crude breakthrough through the dead zone, heavy ships of enemy patrols were converging. "Looks like the local traffic cops heard our racket and are coming to write a speeding ticket," Tara said loudly and with extreme calmness, trying to drown out the rising hum of the overheated turbines. "Let go of the levers. We're cutting the thrust, killing the heat in the shafts, and laying low until they fly past. In this mess of space debris, they won't find us visually if we stop shaking and radiating heat." She sincerely expected that the deathly tired insectoid would release the stiff levers with immense relief, and allow the caravan to simply drift by inertia. But Meridian only gave a low growl, and the sound was more like the screech of tearing sheet metal. The human tactic of passive waiting seemed like a suicidal risk to his rigid logic. To stop meant losing the accumulated kinetic energy, becoming a stationary target, and, most terrifying for his species, completely violating the precise transit schedule. Instead of slowing down as the human advised, he did exactly the opposite. Meridian forcefully jammed the left valve even deeper into the floor, trying to squeeze additional power out of the old maneuvering engines. He wanted to physically outrun the invisible threat, relying only on raw muscular strength. Another lurch of the vast mass of cargo containers echoed with a terrifying, bone-breaking blow in his right shoulder joint. The thick, patterned chitinous plate could not withstand the colossal pressure and cracked in two with a loud, dry snap, releasing thick, pale hemolymph. Sharp, blinding pain shattered Meridian's concentration. His right manipulator jerked, his fingers slipped from the handle wet with fluid, and the massive control rod flew back with terrifying force, nearly crushing the insectoid's chest. The caravan tilted sharply and dangerously to the left. The magnetic couplings let out a strained howl. Meridian collapsed to his knees, trying to hold the remaining valve with his left hand, breathing heavily and fitfully. Tara sprang into action instantly. She rushed to the nearest communication terminal, snatching a heavy emergency wrench from her belt to manually pry open the panel and short the emergency internal comms circuit. "Hold on, I'm calling a medical team and an urgent replacement from the neighboring cargo bay," she shouted, slamming the first part of the authorization code directly onto the exposed contacts. "You've burned out your biological actuators. We can't fly any further like this." With an incredible, terrifying effort, Meridian threw himself away from the steering column. Leaving the lever, he lunged across her path, and his heavy body crashed directly onto the open communication terminal. He physically covered the sparking panel with his cracked shoulder plate. His faceted eyes widened to their limit, radiating no longer exhausting physical pain, but a primal, absolute terror. "Cancel!" he squeezed out, his sensitive mandibles clicking convulsively, splashing pale fluid onto the console. No reports of fatigue, no replacement. The comms must remain silent. Tara recoiled, holding the heavy tool over the console. She stared at the shift lead, Meridian, in confusion. "You're bleeding and can barely stand on your feet. If you don't hand over control to a healthy crew member right now, we'll all turn into atomized space dust along with your precious cargo. Your command needs to know that you are incapacitated and need help. If command finds out I am incapacitated, I will be sent immediately to a technical isolation ward until the end of this shift." The voice of the insectoid Meridian broke into a jagged, wheezing whisper, as if he were voicing his worst nightmare. "And upon arrival at the dock, I will be transferred to the recycling plant. In our ordered life support system, there is no concept of fatigue or injury requiring long-term treatment. A working unit unable to perform 100% of its documented function is classified as a broken gear. Broken parts of the mechanism are not repaired. They are smelted into pure biological material for the next, more efficient cycles. Any open request for help is an official, protocol-certified report of one's own defectiveness." Tara's hand, clutching the wrench, slowly lowered. Her habitual human logic, built on solidarity and the unshakable rule of immediately calling rescuers during any major accident, crashed headlong against the merciless, sterile efficiency of an alien culture. Calling the ship's medics meant killing her partner much faster and more surely than the overheated turbines ever would. She couldn't simply hand him over to his own kind, because those very people represented the most lethal threat to him on the entire ship. For the first time during the entire voyage, Tara realized that the perfect order these creatures were so proud of was maintained by a primal fear of appearing weak. At that moment, a sharp, blindingly white beam from an external searchlight struck through the thick, frozen glass of the archaic technical porthole. The harsh light ruthlessly cut through the gloom of the command center, forcing Tara to wince painfully. The temperature in the locked compartment suddenly stopped, seeming like the main problem. Enemy patrol ships, orienting precisely on the thermal trail and the loud acoustic thuds of the manual maneuvers, had moved into direct firing range. The massive shadows of their armored hulls, bristling with weapons, began to slowly and methodically pin the caravan in a visual pincer maneuver, cutting off any safe escape routes in open space. The cargo flagship was caught in a perfect trap. An open battle with the armed patrol would kill them all within a few minutes, and an official request for internal assistance would kill Meridian immediately upon arrival at a safe dock. To hide both the massive caravan and the shift lead's critical injury from the scanners, the Earth technician was left to search for an invisible escape route right inside the dark technical depths of the stranded ship. A white searchlight beam from the outside sliced through the thick frozen glass, turning the shadows in the command center into long, ugly streaks. The emergency comm speaker was straining with a raspy, panicked clicking. The remaining crew in the lower compartments were demanding either to immediately shut down the main reactors, to surrender to the enemy cruisers, or to fire up the turbines to 300% power for a blind dash through the minefield of the dead sector. Tara did not even turn toward the control console. She was on all fours near an open air duct, where the ventilation grate had fallen out with a clang a minute ago, and was carefully examining a trail of dark, dried slime. 2 heavy patrol cruisers were slowly closing a pincer move on the ship, and every second counted, but the human technician was occupied with things that would look like pure madness from the perspective of any insectoid dot. She took her old dented thermos, unscrewed the scratched lid, and held it to the very edge of the dark technical opening. The thick, hot steam from the dark drink did not dissolve in the command center's stifling air, but instead pulled in a thin, steady stream deep into the metal casing, rapidly disappearing into a narrow gap between the distribution boards. This was simple, raw physics that the flagship's complex automated analyzers had completely ignored, as they considered this internal bulkhead to be an absolutely monolithic wall. The presence of a steady draft meant only one thing. Deep within the technical depths of the cargo ship, there was an undocumented air pocket connected to the external backup airlocks. That unknown inhabitant, which for many months had been methodically eating through the tough insulation of the copper cables, had moved exactly there, instinctively fleeing the unbearable heat of the overheated maneuvering turbines. Tara tightly closed the thermos, tossed it into the deep side pocket of her jumpsuit, and gave a short nod to her partner, pointing her finger at the dark maw of the opened labyrinth of bulkheads. Meridian rose with great difficulty on his 3 remaining supporting limbs, carefully pressing his damaged right manipulator against his cracked shoulder plate. Pale, thick hemolymph was slowly oozing from a deep crack in the darkened chitin, leaving sticky drops on the metal deck. But it was not fear of physical destruction that could be read in his faceted eyes, but a colossal mental resistance. The attempt to pursue a small biological pest through narrow ventilation pipes at a moment when enemy ships stood by the hull with aimed weapons completely shattered the remnants of his rigid operational logic. The insectoid code required staying at one's post until the final signal, submissively awaiting the command's decision or humbly accepting recycling in a safe dock. But certainly not crawling on one's belly behind a human into dark waste collectors. Tara firmly grabbed him by the left shoulder, drawing him into the passage, and Meridian, letting out a soft whistling sigh through his mandibles, submitted to this incomprehensible physical persistence, consciously stepping over the immutable rules of his species for the first time. Inside the long ventilation shaft, it smelled of stagnant dampness, old grease, and overheated copper. The bulkheads around them trembled slightly from the increasing pressure of the external searchlights, which were literally seeing through the caravan's hull, forcing the metal to emit a thin, piteous squeal. Tara moved first, lighting the way with a small handheld flashlight whose old battery was already beginning to fail, emitting a dim yellowish light. The slime on the walls was becoming increasingly fresh and sticky. It glistened in large droplets at the joints of the plates, unerringly indicating the direction of travel. Finally, the narrow passage widened abruptly, ending at a semicircular docking airlock, which had been used by engineers during the vessel's construction several decades ago and had long been excluded from all the caravan's digital maps. There, in the darkest corner, wedged between heavy hydraulic pistons, sat the mysterious creature itself. It was not a giant-jawed monster from the terrifying space legends that the crew feared so much. It was a small, gray-skinned small creature, with 4 tenacious jointed legs and wide, flat eyes that perfectly reflected the faint light of the human flashlight. The parasite trembled slightly with terror, pressing itself into the steel beams and fearfully picking with thin fingers that were encrusted with the remains of cable insulation. But when the huge ship shuddered again from the close passage of a patrol cruiser, the creature made a startlingly precise, lightning-fast movement. It easily leaped over an exposed high-voltage wire without even touching its bare core, and unerringly caught itself on a barely noticeable technological protrusion on the hull, demonstrating an absolute, instinctive knowledge of every curve of this abandoned sector. Tara froze, slowly lowering the light. This tiny local inhabitant, whom the ship's automation had ignored for months as an insignificant error, navigated the dead zone without any radars, using only touch and the memory of physical obstacles. He was their only living navigator, capable of guiding millions of tons of cargo through the debris field. The joy of discovery lasted only 1 second. From the opposite side of the technical corridor leading to the backup airlock, there came the heavy, synchronized thud of many feet. A moment later, the only exit was blocked by about 10 insectoids from the caravan's lower work shift. In their upper manipulators, they gripped heavy welding cutters, massive wrenches, and emergency spikes, which, in the confined space of the narrow compartment, looked like full-fledged combat weapons. Their sensitive antennae rotated frantically, transmitting signals of extreme collective fear and aggression to one another. Driven by an animal instinct for order, they saw the frightened gray creature. They saw the injured shift lead with his cracked shoulder plate, and the human who had finally led them into this dead end. The team furiously demanded the immediate destruction of the source of biological contamination, the welding shut of the damaged compartment, and the complete shutdown of all the flagship's maneuvering systems for an immediate surrender to the patrol outside. The logic of the frightened group suggested the only clear way out: remove the anomaly and surrender to force. Tara took 2 decisive steps forward, deliberately stepping into the line of fire of their improvised weapons and shielding the dark corner. She did not start shouting, referring to regulations, or threatening a tribunal, knowing full well that against a panicking collective mind, any official arguments were useless. Instead, she let out a loud and theatrical sigh, pointedly inspecting the walls of the abandoned airlock covered in old slime. If this is your best recycling squad, then I have massive questions regarding the sanitary cleaning standards on this flagship, Tara said, and her calm, ironic voice sounded completely wild and out of place in the narrow corridor. The poor guy was just trying to find a secluded spot where it doesn't smell so strongly of your overheated wires, and you've dragged half the engineering brigade here with welding torches. Maybe instead of waving those metal scraps around, you could first give him a rag and some proper cleaning detergent. This absurd domestic complaint, voiced in a moment of lethal threat, acted as a powerful mental break for the entire squad. A wave of short, intermittent clicks rippled through the ranks of the armed insectoids. Their behavioral patterns once again failed to process erratic human behavior in time. Taking advantage of this split-second pause of confusion, Tara quickly turned her back to the pointed cutters, completely shielding the frightened stowaway with her body. She dropped to one knee, carefully extending a hand toward the gray limb of the creature, and spoke softly, yet with absolute firmness, looking directly into its wide, flat eyes. "Listen to me, little guy. Those tough guys behind me really want to turn you into a pile of ash, and the patrol cruisers outside will do the same to all of us in a couple of minutes. Show us the trail. Lead this giant hunk of rusty iron out of here, and I promise that no one here will touch you again." A dry metallic click sounded behind Tara's back. One of the frightened insectoids had raised a heavy cutter after all, aiming its thin flame directly at the center of her spine. The armed crowd froze one step away from an irreparable decision, torn between the habitual order to surrender and the terrifying human unknown. Everything in this locked compartment now depended on whether the frightened creature would respond to this strange request, and whether the injured shift lead, standing exactly halfway between his kin and Tara, would dare to raise his only intact manipulator to protect a human. The thin blue flame of the cutter hummed just a few centimeters from Tara's back. The air in the technical depths became scorchingly dry. The small creature, pressed against the bulkhead, did not take its wide, flat eyes off the human. It saw the aimed, improvised weapons, felt the nervous tremors of the terrified insectoid crowd, and heard the heavy strikes of enemy cruisers against the outer hull. The choice was perfectly clear: burn in this dead end right now, or try to get away. The creature let out a short guttural sound, turned, and struck a rusty pipe of the hidden conduits with force using its narrow, jointed palm. A dull vibration traveled through the old metal. The parasite darted into an unlit side shaft, stopping at every turn and waiting for Tara to illuminate the path with her fading handheld flashlight. The shift lead took the only step possible in his condition. He heavily wedged himself directly into the narrow passage between the human and the armed crowd. His cracked chitinous shell creaked quietly, emitting the distinct, sharp scent of spilled hemolymph. He didn't utter a single word. He simply blocked the line of fire physically with his massive body, forcing the lower shift to lower their cutters. The instinct of collective obedience to a senior officer still functioned, even if that officer was bleeding and violating regulations. The massive caravan moved blindly along the new route. It wasn't a proper flight, but a painful, grinding crawl through a dense field of drifting debris. The small creature ahead unerringly sensed the slightest changes in external pressure, pointing out narrow physical corridors between chunks of old armor and pieces of dead asteroids. Tara relayed the direction to the shift lead, and he, relying on the remnants of his muscular strength, distributed manual thrust at the only surviving console in the technical section. Enemy searchlights skated across their hulls, but could not detect the slow, cooling ships through the thick magnetic dust. After 2 grueling hours, the floor shuddered from a powerful rhythmic jolt. The external magnetic grapples closed on the hull with a loud clang, and the caravan was finally pulled into the safety of the platform. The dead control panels suddenly flared with a steady green light. The dock's automation forcibly seized navigation, returning the insectoid crew to its perfect systemic reality. But the long-awaited relief did not arrive. As the internal airlocks parted with a hiss, the blinding fluorescent light of the port lamps flooded into the technical corridor. On the wide metal platform, a dense armed cordon of internal security was already waiting for them. The crowd from the lower shift, which had followed the shift lead closely, instantly poured out, their mandibles clicking loudly and chaotically. They were in a desperate hurry to restore their status within the proper system, interrupting one another and pointing their manipulators at the violators. The light of the port lamps mercilessly highlighted every detail of this wrong picture: the Earth technician covered in machine grease, the small creature huddling against her boots, and, most importantly, the cracked shoulder of the shift lead. The port commander, encased in polished uniform armor, took a stiff step forward. His faceted eyes quickly scanned the shift lead. The bureaucratic protocol was relentless and absolutely transparent. The officer emitted a dry crackle, confirming the official status aloud. Critical damage to the support node. Total inability to perform the documented work function. 2 guards immediately detached from the formation, unfurling dense capture nets. The shift lead was to be sent to the recycling plant right from here, without any medical reports or investigations. 3 more insectoids aimed paralyzing emitters at the small creature, preparing to sterilize the unknown biological threat. The shift lead lowered himself heavily onto his remaining limbs, humbly accepting the end of his cycle to avoid wasting the group's resources on repairing a broken tool. The Earth technician stepped directly into the center of the forming semicircle, roughly shoving aside the paralyzing emitter pointed at her with her shoulder. "Belay that sterilization," she said loudly, with emphasized irritation, causing the security officer to falter in his step. "You are ruining the purity of my measurements." She thrust her hand into the deep pocket of her work jumpsuit and pulled out the dented, scratch-covered Earth thermos. A brief, incredibly dense silence fell. The guards looked back and forth in confusion from the aggressive human to the old metal cylinder. "Do you seriously think the navigation network of a massive caravan just went down on its own in such a convenient spot?" The Earth technician raised the thermos above her head as if displaying an unexploded bomb. "I personally shorted the main bus in the command center. I needed to create conditions of absolute stress and physical overload to test this unstable chemical catalyst." She pointed a free finger with disdain at the frozen shift lead. "I forced the shift lead to switch to manual control and dragged the entire caravan on mechanical valves. I needed data on how his biological drives withstand this reagent under conditions of critical exhaustion. He is not defective. He is simply a test subject who was following a direct order as part of my scientific sabotage. And this little parasite," she nodded casually toward the small creature, "was actually my backup sensor for the temperature of the outer hull." The statement was such a monstrous violation of every conceivable security rule that the security officer's receptor antennae twitched nervously. To voluntarily disable a cargo flagship for the sake of an unauthorized test? This fundamentally did not fit into insectoid logic, but it was precisely this incredible audacity that caused the system to glitch. "Verify the substance," the officer commanded sharply, not lowering his weapon, but not giving the order to seize them either. One of the inspectors cautiously approached the Earth technician, holding a portable dock analyzer in his upper manipulators. The device, calibrated to recognize thousands of types of rocket fuel, industrial acids, and sterile nutrient mixtures, hovered over the thermos. Tara unscrewed the lid with absolute calmness. The high-sensitivity scanner drew in a portion of hot steam with a quiet hum. For a second, nothing happened. Then the analyzer emitted a piercing double beep, and a bright red warning symbol lit up on its matte screen. The inspector recoiled hastily, as if struck by high voltage. "The dock system does not recognize the composition," he reported, his mandibles clicking rapidly and anxiously. extremely high concentration of unknown alkaloids and organic acids. Status: unknown complex chemical factor, completely absent from the database of permitted transit reagents. The alien's perfect bureaucratic machine turned in the necessary direction with a soft click. The device issued an official systemic conclusion, which the command was obliged to accept as an indisputable fact. An ordinary earth beverage, brewed from over-roasted coffee beans, proved too crude, dirty, and complex for the port's sterile chemical databases. For the insectoids, this became 100% documented proof that the human had indeed smuggled a prohibited chemical composition on board and conducted dangerous manipulations. The port commander lowered his emitter. His strict operational logic quickly reconstructed his worldview based on the new systemic data. If the failure was caused by proven external sabotage rather than an internal error of the caravan, then the protocols changed cardinally. "Change the status of the labor unit," the officer commanded dryly, pointing at Meridian. "Critical damage sustained as a result of recorded external sabotage. Category: victim of a hostile environment. Cancel recycling. Direct to the recovery block at the expense of the Dock Security Service Insurance Fund." The guards obediently folded their dense nets. The crowd of the lower shift, suddenly deprived of their main systemic reason for a riot, began to shift unsteadily on the spot. They had demanded the punishment of a broken commander, but now, instead of a defective cog, an officially recognized injured employee sat before them. In this brief commotion of status redistribution, no one paid attention to the dark technical corner of the platform. The small creature, instinctively sensing that the paralyzing beams were no longer aimed at it, slipped silently toward the nearest ventilation grate of the dock and dissolved forever into the labyrinth of communications. Tara calmly screwed on the thermos lid, handed it to the bewildered inspector as the primary evidence of the crime, and stretched both hands forward. "The test experiment is complete. You may process the detention," she said evenly. The security officer, still trying to digest the scale of human recklessness with his processor algorithms, silently snapped heavy magnetic bracelets onto her wrists. Meridian, who was already being carefully lifted by the arriving port medics, looked at Tara. In his faceted eyes, there was no longer any exhausting, primal terror. He saw with absolute clarity how the human had just voluntarily traded her physical freedom for one correct phrasing in someone else's rigid regulations. The caravan was saved, the rules were observed, and the flawless bureaucracy submissively swallowed the perfect lie to the accompaniment of the chaotic clicking of the bewildered crew. The high office of the head of dock security shone with surgical whiteness. Tara sat on a hard metal chair, feeling the heavy magnetic bracelets pull her wrists down, digging into her skin. Directly in front of her, on an ideally smooth table made of matte polymer, stood her old dented thermos. The port commander, a large insectoid with silvery veins on a thick chitinous collar, cautiously hooked the scratched lid with the tip of a thin analytical probe. A soft click sounded, and the lid flipped back. The commander peered inside. At the bottom of the shiny steel flask, a thick brown sludge of coffee grounds had dried. He reached with his upper manipulator toward the tablets, where the red report of deadly chemical sabotage glowed brightly, then looked again at the dirty stains inside the container. His sensitive antennae froze for a second, and then twitched with a fine, irritated tremor. He understood everything. The unknown factor turned out to be a primitive organic decoction. To officially acknowledge that a massive cargo flagship was saved by dirty water from burnt beans and barbarian manual labor would mean launching a total competence audit of the entire shift. For the rigid bureaucratic machine, this would guarantee the mass recycling of an excellent crew and a massive scandal. The port commander slowly lowered the lid of the thermos back into place, tightening the threads firmly. He pressed the intercom button on the terminal, connecting to the main port network. "The case regarding sabotage is closed," he grated dryly into the microphone. "The incident is classified as a technical anomaly of the cooling reservoir, causing a cascading navigation failure due to incompatibility of port materials. No biological threat is present. The caravan's operational status is restored. The connection cut off." The port commander shifted the unblinking gaze of his faceted eyes toward the Earth technician. He typed a short command on the console and slid a printed fine notice across the desk. The amount was colossal, a total withholding of wages for 3 standard flight cycles, plus an official reprimand entered into her transit profile for violating luggage regulations. Tara silently pressed her thumb to the scanner, acknowledging the massive debt. It was a fair price to pay so that the local timid small creature could keep living in the ventilation pipes, and Meridian could lie in a medical pod instead of being sent to the recycling plant. The port commander pressed the final key on the console. The magnetic bracelets on Tara's wrists clicked dully and fell apart into two halves, stinging her skin with a painful brush of residual static charge. She rubbed her stiff joints with obvious relief. The port commander leaned forward, resting all four upper limbs on the desk, so close that Tara caught the dry, sharp scent of ozone from his formal armor. Never, he said in a low, wheezing whisper, devoid of any bureaucratic tone. Bring your dirty liquids onto my ships again, and never break my control systems in such a primitive manner. The port infrastructure stood today only because I myself allowed it to close its eyes to the truth. There will not be a second time. Understood, boss? I will switch to tea bags, Tara replied hoarsely, rising from her chair. She stepped out of the office into the wide transit corridor of the port. Without her heavy tool belt, with her face stained by technical grease, and an absolutely empty credit account, Tara felt unusually light. The bright light stung her eyes after the long, grueling hours in the gloom of the freezing command center. There were about 30 steps left to the passenger terminal airlock when a massive figure blocked her path. The shift lead stood right in the middle of the walkway. His cracked right shoulder was tightly bound with wide medical staples, over which a thick layer of fresh polymer glue shimmered. The insectoid's supporting limbs still trembled slightly from deep muscular exhaustion, but he no longer looked like a broken part of a cargo mechanism. The shift lead was waiting for her here, in the open port area, where surveillance cameras continuously recorded every movement of the employees. Tara stopped, not knowing what words to choose for a foreign officer whose perfect professional life she had just turned upside down. Meridian did not click his mandibles or issue dry, regulatory greetings. He silently thrust his left healthy manipulator under the rigid uniform plate on his chest. What he pulled out from there made Tara's mouth hang open in surprise. It was her scratched earth thermos, a piece of physical evidence from a closed case that was supposed to go to the port impound for long months until its total destruction. To retrieve it, Meridian must have personally accessed the storage locker, ignored the security system, and carried the prohibited item out right under his armor. For a senior insectoid whose life had always been built on flawless and blind obedience to the rules, this was an act of absolute, conscious professional misconduct for the sake of a human. He extended the metal cylinder forward. Tara took it carefully, feeling the familiar weight of the cold steel as it settled into her palm. She lifted her eyes to the insectoid, expecting a lengthy explanation, but none followed. Meridian simply turned away. His heavy boots began to beat a steady, measured rhythm against the metal floor plates of the corridor as he moved off toward the living quarters of his shift. Tara looked down at the dented lid of the thermos. There was nothing inside but dried coffee residue, but now this piece of old earth metal weighed far more than ordinary travel gear. Tara shoved the thermos deep into the pocket of her work jumpsuit, adjusted her collar, and started walking toward the exit of the port.